Good afternoon. It's Mr. Cohen. I'm coming to you today with four more poems to talk about. Today I'm going to talk about Reluctance by Robert Frost, and Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson, and I Sit and Look Out by Walt Whitman, and Spring and All by William Carlos Williams. These are all American poets born in the 19th century. Before I talk about these poems, I'd just like to spend one more second on this poem that I talked about a couple days ago, Caged Bird by Maya Angelou. There's a real juxtaposition, antithesis, a kind of foiling that happens between these two birds, the free bird and the caged bird. If I were to read this, if I were to do a little video of this, I would really try to act it out a little bit, not physically, but just in terms of the way I say it, tone. Like Freebird, there's a kind of uh, awe at his state. Wow, look at that Freebird. A free bird leaps on the back of the wind and floats downstream till the current ends and dips his wing and so on. But when you get to the caged bird, you could change your tone of voice. How might you say it? But a bird that stalks down his narrow cage can seldom see through his bars of rage. When you find such a contrast, such a contradiction between images in something that you're reading, you want to kind of mark it with your tone of voice. So that's just a suggestion for a caged bird. So to get to the first poem, this is Reluctance by Robert Frost. And let's see. First, I'd like to talk about the title, Reluctance. Sometimes title is very important. Like in the poem that we talked about last time, Sympathy, it kind of captured the emotional, conceptual state that is being explained, described, discussed in the poem. And it seems like we have a similar kind of story in this poem as well. Reluctance. This is the word that captures what the speaker is wrestling with or engaged in or celebrating, although you don't really celebrate reluctance. You reluctantly, you have a kind of reluctance, even if you think reluctance is the right step. Anyway, I thought it would be good to come up with some synonyms and antonyms for reluctance. Like, I think this one here is the closest: hesitation, doubt, and uncertainty. And antonyms like surety, conviction, and certainty. So, reluctance is kind of a state of hesitation, like you're not sure. You can't really move forward. There's something kind of holding you back. So first, I'd like to talk about the rhyme scheme in this poem. This is, I'm just going to number the first stanza, the lines in the first stanza. This poem has four stanzas, and there are six lines in each. It's a 24-line poem. First, let's talk about rhyme. You do notice a certain rhyme scheme. You have um, A, B, C, and then wended rhymes with descended, B again, and home is brand new. And then ended rhymes with wended and descended. And so it looks like lines 2, 4, and 6 all rhyme. You're going to notice in each stanza you'll find this. Like in the second stanza, keeping is going to rhyme with creeping and sleeping. And in the third stanza, you have thither and whither and another but different whither, and then treason and reason and season. Now, these rhymes are what we call feminine rhymes, or we say that it's kind of a double, it's got a double ending. And we've talked about feminine rhymes before. You notice, like, in most rhyming situations, the rhyme word is a stressed syllable. But here we have a stressed syllable like wend, and then there's an unstressed syllable at the end. And so this is kind of different than here. I'm going to give you two examples of masculine rhymes from very famous poems. Here's another poem by Robert Frost. Whose woods these are, I think I know. You see, your voice kind of goes down. It's very definite. There's a certain kind of certainty, conviction, surety in your voice in each as you come to the end of each line. His house is in the village, though. Here's another poem, very famous poem by a guy named William Ernst Henley, called Invictus. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. There's a real definiteness when you come to the rhyme, when you come to the last word in the line. It's quite different here in Reluctance with these feminine rhymes. You can hear it out through the fields and the woods, and over the walls I have wended. I have climbed the hills of view, and looked at the world and descended. I have come by the highway home, and lo, it is ended. There's a much more reluctant or uncertain feeling when you come to the end of the line. Frost was a real technician, really conscientious kind of poet, and he often worked to make the meaning or the sense of the poem, what is being said in the poem, for the understanding to match or echo the sound or kind of the elements of poetry, the elements of sound like meter and rhyme. And so we have reluctance being spoken about in a kind of reluctant manner. Next, I'd like to talk about um, the the meter of this poem. Last time there was a poem in two in Demeter. There was a poem in four, sympathy. When the sun is bright on the upland slopes, four beats in a line. Here we have trimeter. Do you see it? Out through the fields and the woods, and over the walls I have wended. I have climbed the hills of view, and looked at the world and descended. In each line, except for line 6, there are three beats. In line 6, we shift to 2, and lo, it is ended. And we see that throughout all the stanzas. It's a very highly organized poem. Another thing to so there are three beats in a line. Another thing to consider is I showed you this word anapest last time we talked, which is a foot that goes weak, weak, strong. We talked about anapest in a discussion about this poem called Sympathy. Do you remember how it went? When the sun is bright on the upland slope. That had a very strict organization. How did it go? It went anapest, I am, anapest, I am. When the sun is bright on the upland slope. Here we have something a little bit different. Each line has at least one I am and one anapest, but they're placed in all different places. The first line seems to start with a strong syllable, and it feels like there's a missing unstressed syllable here. So it goes out through the fields and the woods. And so the first one would be an I am, and then two anapasts. The second line would be and O. That's starts off there with an I am, and over the walls. That's a over the walls. That's an anapest. Um, I have when, and then you have this extra feminine ending, unstressed syllables at the end. So the second line goes, I am Anapest, Anapest. Let's look at the third line. I have climbed, starts with an Anapest, the hills, that's an I am, of view, that's an I am as well, and looked at the world and descended. Line 4 is I am Anapest, Anapest. I have come by the highway home. It goes Anapest, Anapest, I am. And then the sixth line goes, and lo, that's an I am. It is N, that's an Anapest. And so these lines are built of anapests and iams, at least one in each line. And when you can kind of get it, you will be able to read this really well. It's a beautifully constructed poem. Let's go on to the next stanza. The leaves are all dead on the ground, save those that the oak is keeping, to ravel them one by one and let them go scraping and creeping out over the crusted snow when others are sleeping. Here it's definitely wintertime. We have leaves dead on the ground and we have snow. There's just a few little leaves left on the oak tree. It's going to let go of them one by one. The next one. Now, this line, you might not know how to read it at first. You might want to go, and the dead leaves lie huddled and still, but really try to keep the beat and see if that works. I was wrestling with this line, but I think it wants to go, and the dead leaves lie huddled and still. And again, the next line, no longer blown hither and thither. The dead leaves are just lying there. The last lone aster is gone, the flowers of witch hazel wither. The heart is still aching to seek, but the feet question whither. Something about the heart. The heart wants to go on and do something new, but there's a kind of hesitation, a reluctance. The feet are like, again. It starts off, remember at the top, it starts off, I've wended, I've climbed the hills of you, I've looked at the world, and now I've descended, I've come home. Now, what happens? The heart is aching to seek more travel, more motion, more running out into the world. The last stanza is with one long question. One long question. When to the heart, I think we have heart, heart. When to the heart of man was it ever less than a treason to go with the drift of things, to yield with a grace to reason, and bow and accept the end of a love or a season? Like so often, our hearts consider it treasonous, a betrayal to just be, to just go along with the drift of things, to just yield and give in with a kind of graceful attitude to reason, to understanding, which seems to be opposed to the heart here. Understanding, wow, it's over. This phase of life is over. It's winter time. We can't go out and live in the world right now. We just have to sit back and accept the way things are, right? There's some virtue, it seems Frost is suggesting, to reluctance. Uh, Very good. I'd like to next talk about a poem called Because I Could Not Stop for Death. That's what we call it. Emily Dickinson, I'm not an expert in Emily Dickinson. I was looking at the number, but I can't remember it. She wrote, or there are 1,800 or so of her poems that are published. She did not name her poems. We give them all the name of their first line. This poem we call, because its first line is, "Because I could not stop for death." Um, Emily Dickinson really loved a certain meter. She was a churchgoer and she read many hymns at church, and she used the meter that she found in hymns. It's the most common meter of all. It's the most not the most common meter that you find in formal literary poetry like the poems that we have in this packet, but it's used all the time in songs and all the time in church. Like, here's a song that you might know, Amazing Grace, which was written quite a while ago in the 18th century. But it's got a certain kind of beat to it. Sometimes it's called 8-6-8-6 because the first line has 8 syllables, 6 syllables, 8 syllables, 6 syllables. The first line is iambic tetrameter. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. 8 syllables. Dot 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 dot. The next one is iambic trimeter that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. And this is a very, very, very common um, meter. It's called common meter, or sometimes it's called hymn meter. And Emily Dickinson uses it quite often. She uses it here. She uses it in I don't know. As I said, I'm not a Emily Dickinson expert, but she uses it in um, half. I want to say half of her poems. This a 4 line stanza, a quatrain that goes 4-3-4-3. Because I could not stop for death, right? Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. So that's the beat of it. She is a very revolutionary rhymer. Sometimes she will come up with an exact rhyme, but more often than not, you're dealing with an approximate rhyme, or what she liked to call a slant rhyme. So lines 2 and 4, let's focus on those. Ring and sun, chill and tool. They don't rhyme, but they don't not rhyme. They're close. Here we have, she does this sometimes too. She repeats words. The story of this poem, it's kind of a very rich and interesting thing that she liked to do in her poetry. A theme that she developed a number of times. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The speaker in this poem is dead. And we will find out by the end of the poem that the speaker has been dead for many centuries. Wow. I showed you this poem earlier in the year, which is story wise the same poem. I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. The eyes around had wrung them dry, the breaths were gathering firm for that last onset when the king be witnessed in the room. You notice firm and room, how cute. The corpse is waiting for the king, but instead, who shows up instead? A fly. Death was not what she expected. She went to church. She got a story about the king coming to steal her away. And what she found was much more material and much less glorious. Something Emily Dickinson liked to talk about, and she does it in this poem too. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves in immortality. This poem is so famous and might be alluded to in another poem I talked about just the other day, which is A Conscientious Objector. Do you remember? But this death, there's a personification of death with a capital D in both poems, and you find it at the end of the first line, right? So, I mean, here we got because I could not stop for death. I shall die, but that is all that I shall do for death. The death that Emily Dickinson starts talking about, oh, he kindly stopped for me. We slowly drove, he knew no haste. And I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. He's this death, Emily Dickinson's death, is civil. And what else? He knows no haste. This death in this poem, he's in haste, right? This death is in a hurry, and he's not very civil. What does death do? He flick my shoulders with his whip, with his hoof on my breast, right? I don't know. Maybe it was a different time. I mean, Emily Dickinson, she was living in the middle section of the 19th century. There was quite a bit of war and death, but maybe it didn't touch her so much. Living up in New England, she was uh, in her 30s during the Civil War. But Edna St. Vincent Millay, she lived during the Spanish flu in World War One, a time when there was maybe a bit more pessimism. So that's worth looking at. But it goes on. She's Emily Dickinson again. We slowly drove. He knew no haste, and I. So there's a carriage, and she enjoys a kind of random. Maybe there's a rhyme or a reason to it, but it seems at first to be a random kind of capitalization. The carriage held but just ourselves. Who? Death and me, right? And immortality. Oh, immortality is there too. So, who do we got in this carriage? We have the speaker, we have death, and immortality, which means not dying, right? She has this picture, like she had in this other poem, I Heard a Fly Buzz, of what life after death is going to be. And that there'd be death and immortality. Immortal means not immortal, means not dying. That there'll be some kind of transcendence of death in death. And she has this picture of death as some kind of gentleman. He kindly stopped for me. We slowly drove. It was very slow. And then we passed through the stages of life. School, that's children, that's the past. And the fields of gazing grain, like the grain has a bit of you can kind of see an eye in a piece of grain and past the setting sun, right? So this is kind of like this is like early life, and this is like middle age, and this is old age, or rather, he passed us. I think that's the setting sun. We get more personification here. We have uh, we have the speaker and death and immortality and a carriage, and the sun actually passes us. Oh, the dews drew quivering and chill. For gossamer, my gown, it was her gown, what she was wearing, was such a fine fabric. My tippet only tulle. Her clothes are not appropriate for her journey. We paused before a house that seemed swelling in the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. And so I just like to show you a picture here of a cornice. Here's some pictures of a cornice. Let's see, it's going to come in a second. This is like an architectural feature, like this piece here at the top of a building, where you can see here it's the cornice of her new home was in the ground. Where does she wind up? We paused before a house that seemed a swelling in the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. She's being driven by death to her new home. Where is the cornice? The cornice is in the ground. You could barely see the roof. Where does she end up? She ends up buried in the ground. And then it goes on, since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. This is not an easy bit here. She surmised, she guessed, she figured out that the horses' heads were pointed towards eternity. And so she thought she was going to be immortal, but instead she got eternity. And usually when we think of the word eternity, we think, oh, that's nice. It's kind of it's the negation of time. And in this last poem, we saw the word eternity, and when death comes, I think, therefore, I look upon everything as a brotherhood and a sisterhood. I look upon time as no more than an idea. Eternity is another possibility. Maybe when I die, time will disappear, and I will live in some state after death. But I wanted to show you a kind of old, important poem to his coy mistress. Um, the first part, I'm kind of running out of video space, so I'm just going to summarize it. He's talking to a woman, the speaker in this poem, who he really is fond of, and she's being coy. She's being kind of distant and shy, but slightly flirtatious at the same time. The conceit is, if if um, if had we but world enough and time, this coyness, lady, were no crime. If time lasted forever, then maybe it would be fine for you to uh, continue to be cold to me. And then here it comes. But at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near, and yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. Like we're going, I'm hearing time's winged chariot. Thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing song. What we have before us are deserts of vast eternity, a kind of endlessness where we will be dead and nothing brilliant, beautiful, special will happen. So there is a kind of a tradition of eternity being a negative, a deserted thing. And so she was expecting immortality, and instead, what she found was that the horses, again with the horses, death and the horses, um, since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. So she figured it out. She sees she sees the mound of dirt. She's in her carriage with death and immortality, and she figures it out that her destiny is not immortality, but a kind of eternal life in death. So I wanted to spend a little more time with the two other poems, but I seem to get so excited talking about Frost and Dickinson. So let's just call this two poems. Today it was Robert Frost, Reluctance, and Emily Dickinson, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. Ciao. Talk to you soon.